I see familiar faces. Lynette, is that you? Good to see you. Oh, that just warms my heart. I'm sorry, Nathan. I just had that. I had to say something. Okay.
Fine. So good evening, everyone. Most of you probably saw the message that I just sent to the chat before I admitted you. We'll probably get started in, well, not probably, we will get started in about like 2 minutes. We just want to kind of give folks a little bit of time to continue to join. And then we'll go from there. But in the meantime, take care of yourself. Do what you need to do. I know it's early evening for some and later evening for most. So thank you for being here. All Okay, so I'm also keeping an eye on the admissions as well. So that's why I keep looking up folks. But yes, let's actually get going. To be respectful of everyone's time. For joining us tonight, and then also of course for our guest speaker, Provost Williams, being honoring her time as well. So first I'll start just introducing myself, and then the members of the BSA board will quickly introduce ourselves, and then we will introduce our guest speaker, Provost Williams, and then we will give her the floor to present to us tonight and connect with us. So I know many people here, but formally introduce myself. My name is Nathan Smith. I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the clinical psych program. I am BSA's vice president. I've been a part of BSA since I started the program, and I'm one of many BSA executive board members that are here with us tonight.
I can go next. My name is Shania Greenwood. Good evening, everyone. I am a fifth year in the clinical psych program. I am currently waiting to go to internship this summer, which is crazy to even say. I'm also a member of the e-board. I am the treasurer and special events coordinator as well. Thank you all for coming.
Everyone, my name is Sheila Turner. I am a fifth year in the general/applied psychology program, and I currently serve as secretary of the Black Student Association, and I've been involved for several years now. Thank you. You want me to go ahead and transition?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Hello, esteemed faculty, staff, and students. Welcome, and thank you for attending the Black Student Association's Diversity Speaker Series honoring Women's History Month. I am honored and privileged to introduce our illustrious Provost, Senior Vice President, and 2023 APA Presidential Citation recipient, Wendi S. Williams, Ph.D. Provost Williams completed her undergraduate degree in psychology, which was her major, and African and African American studies, which was her minor, at the University of California. She went on to complete her Master's of Arts in Psychology at Pepperdine University. Provost Williams followed up her Master's of Arts with a doctorate in counseling psychology from Georgia State University. Provost Williams has over 20 years of experience as a scholar, clinician, advocate, author, and administrator. Before she was appointed provost at Fielding Graduate University, Provost Williams served as the dean of the School of Education at Mills College and associate dean of academic affairs at Bank Street College Graduate School of Education, to name a few of her academic achievements. I am unsure where she finds the time, but the provost is an accomplished author, publishing We Matter, Intersectional Anti-Racist Feminist Interventions with Black Girls and Women, and more recently, Black Women at Work on Refusal and Recovery, which we hope she will draw from today. And I believe the provost also has another upcoming book, The Majestic Place, The Freedom of Possible in Black Women's Leadership. I would be remiss to mention that she has also authored both journal articles and articles for news and magazine publications. As displayed by her writing, causes, and podcasts, Provost Williams fiercely advocates for Black women and girls, leadership, and liberation. She uses her voice to speak on these matters, not only on her podcast, but during conferences. I hope you had an opportunity to see her talk at APA 2023. If not, you missed a treat. As well as her roles in various organizations. She is co-chair of Girls Leadership, as well as the previous president of Psychology of Women, Division 35 of the American Psychological Association. Her podcast, She Been Ready, is evidence of her continued work of bringing women's voices to the forefront. Listening to Provost Williams' podcast, I can appreciate her desire to get information to the masses, eliminating obstacles often placed by the ivory tower. I especially love when she asked her guests to ponder when they knew they were ready to leave. Outside of her busy schedule, I gleaned that she enjoys spending time reading, tending to her plants, spending time with family and friends, and the great outdoors. With no further ado, I present Provost and Senior Vice President Wendi S. Williams, Ph.D., and our future American Psychological Association President, Dr. Williams. We have allocated at least an hour for you to speak, and we asked for 30 minutes for questions. Hopefully that'll be enough.
Wow. Well, that was just such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you. I need permission to share my screen. Yeah, it's kind of overwhelming even to hear all those things. I wonder where I find the time to. Let's see here if that's okay. Now it's available. And let me just do one thing really quickly. Okay. Let's try this one more time. Let's see. There we go. Okay. I want to make sure I show you the right window. Are you all able to see that? Okay. Yeah. So very glad to be here. I want to say just a special thank you to my colleagues, our students at Fielding in the BSA and their leadership, and also for the invitation to speak to you all. It's a gift to be able to share all the things you do with your family. And I feel at Fielding, we have that relationship and really care a lot about being in community and a learning community with one another. And just feels really special to share this work with you all. So I was asked to talk about refusal, recovery, and reclamation. There's a little nod to my book there because of the tagline, refusal and recovery. And I love that our students asked me to talk about reclamation, this idea of getting your power back. It's really, really important. And so the subtext here is promoting well-being and balance in the academic community. And there are pieces of information down there below if you wanted to follow some of the pieces that Sheila mentioned in terms of some of my work. So I thought I would start off by reading the back cover of the book to you because it gives you a sense, a little bit of sort of what this book is about and how I'm using it as a framework to describe and to talk through how we might address some of the issues as they arise in higher education context. So Around water coolers and over glasses of wine, Black women come together and process the ways in which their labor is taken for granted and their excellence called into question. Black women at work on refusal and recovery makes the direct connection between these contemporary experiences and the long legacy of Black labor exploitation. Through the trafficking and enslavement of Africans, European Americans laid the inhumane foundation of their present-day wealth and privileged and established oppressive labor dynamics for workers that persist to this day. In this work, I want to move, and I try to move the conversation beyond this sort of stubborn audacity of inequity. We know that exists, and really to focus instead on the powerful history and example of Black women's labor and refusal practices, on the potent role that choice and voice can play in dismantling seemingly impenetrable systems of unfairness. I don't really remain convinced that systems of unfairness have won, and I think that we can win. And so what I like to talk about in my book is some of the strategies that Black women have used over time to do that, and how that then can shape wellness practices for all of us in the context of our work. I was asked to talk about wellness in the academic context, and I know that that is fraught, primarily because, well, higher ed is sort of known for trying to weed out the ones who shouldn't continue on, right? There is a part of this that is normalized, a part of some of the challenging activities and behaviors of systems and structures and human beings in this space that can be really, really problematic, and I would say toxic for folks who do not fit the status quo, who are not white and male and able-bodied, who are not heterosexual, who are not cisgendered, right? So these are some of those normative ideas that shape who's welcome to be in a space. And then for all others, you kind of have to try to get in where you can fit in, if you can ever fit in. What I want to do with you all today is talk a little bit about the underlying or root causes that shape BIPOC folks' experiences in the workplace, and then to undergird that with what that means for BIPOC folks in academia. I want to talk a little bit about what happens to BIPOC folks in this space matters for all of us, and then to lift up some of the typical experiences of BIPOC folks in academia. And then finally to end with the refusal practices that allow BIPOC folks to recover their peace of mind and perspective while at work and school. Now, you may note that I'm conflating work and school, and that is because most times when folks enter into higher education, it's because they have a professional or career goal or aspiration that they're trying to attain. So the stakes are really high. And so when you are someone who is experiencing discrimination, microaggressions in that space, and are targeted or are feeling targeted, it has a specific and unique impact to make you feel perhaps that you might not be able to achieve this goal that you have. And I think it's probably one of the most aggressive things to do to an individual, to try to tap out their dream. Right? So each of our students and each of us, when we were in higher ed, attempting to gather, move forward with our degree completion, needed faith, needed encouragement and support. And when we don't have that, that can be really problematic. Furthermore, when you have experiences of that being targeted and being treated poorly in those spaces, it's even worse. So I like to take a step back and think through this idea of the root cause of some of these issues. I do take a perspective of the idea of radical, and I don't mean politically radical. I mean in terms of the divisive nature that we use in our society today, but really the root cause of, or rather the root ideal of radicalism, which is to look at root cause or fundamental ideas that shape a thing. And so the idea simply is this, that there are root causes, contributing factors, underlying issues that are underneath a situation, a circumstance, a set of challenges or opportunities that we see. But what we see is all the things above ground. So we don't necessarily see the complex of issues and challenges and the undermining there. Like if there were a gopher down here, we don't see that. We just notice that our plant is not growing very well, right? If there's some environmental, I don't know, disease or mineral that's really toxic for this plant to grow, we wouldn't necessarily know that unless we tested to understand what these underlying dynamics are. We just know that we would see the problem above ground. Sometimes we try to address problems by addressing the problem, And that's fine because we are able to see what's in front of us. The reality is that unless we address the root cause, what's beneath here, we'll never really address this problem. And so when I think about and trying to understand the experiences of BIPOC folks in academia, there are a few things for us to sit with. One is that we are looking at a legacy of extracted labor from unfree people on stolen land. We have to really appreciate that context. We have to appreciate that context because it sets up everything else that comes after it. So when we think about our higher ed institutions, there are a number of them that are engaging in some reparative practices currently, but many of them are able to be our most esteemed higher ed institutions, for example, had slaves, were made possible from unpaid labor. From people on stolen land, we're able to build the buildings that were built, and we're able to have the access and the opportunities and the privilege for those who were able to attend those institutions. In the early days, it was propertied white men of wealth. Property equaled the wealth, and women were not necessarily gaining access to institutions, at least in the early days. Workplaces are the contemporary marketplace for ideas and practices of worthiness and compensation. So I know this from my own experience of mentoring and supporting students and mentees through their, for example, contract negotiations and new employment negotiations. I'm often supporting students and early career folks who are navigating that. And it's in that moment where we recognize that you have the degree, but you still have to navigate, and you interviewed well for the job. And then it's time to set up that contract and make sure that you're going to receive what you're worth and have all the bells and whistles that you deserve. And we know that we see those inequities across folks of difference in terms of gender and race and ability status, and how they're compensated for their labor. Academia is a workplace. So there are folks on the call today who either work in the institutions of higher ed and even work at Fielding. And it's also a training ground for the workplace. It's a training ground for professionalism. So it's a very early socializing context for what one can come to expect in the workplace. And that's why it's so important for us to really explore what's happening in these spaces that either support, lift up, and amplify our students and our staff and our faculty and ensure that they are supported, and/or that tear them down and create systems of inequity that then perpetuate the inequities that we see in our society over time. These dynamics play out through interpersonal and systemic structural practices. So it's individual, but what I want to underscore for you here is that, and something I say in the book, is that being nice is not going to do away with racism. Being kind even won't. Policy changes will. Changes in behavior follow mandating those changes. And so I'm often in the space, and one of the reasons why I enjoy being a university administrator and a provost is because you actually have the possibility of creating context, policies, and implementation that can create the equity and the fairness that allows for folks to reach their full potential. That's the power in that space, and I enjoy that very much. So why does this matter? A lot of times, and especially with my work, and Sheila highlighted that I focus a lot of my work and attention on Black women and girls. And the reason being is that I wanted to very early, I noted in my career that there was not very specific focus on lifting up not only the negative experiences, so not just lifting up a deficit model or a deficiency model of the experience of Black people, and particularly women and girls, because the intersection of race and gender really does unpack and create a narrative of weakness, of vulnerability, and it doesn't always demonstrate where the strength is, or we rely on stories of strength through adversity, but we don't think about what it means to be strong and vibrant and creative irrespective of what oppression is happening in the society. It's really important for me in my work, for our students, for the folks that I study, for the world that we're looking in, that we're not always having the lens be through one's reaction to oppression or to a white gaze. And so that feels really important. But what I will say is this, and we've seen it throughout gosh, the last number of years, we've seen a lot of union and striking activity and labor action and job action. And I have to say, I'm the daughter of a union man. My dad was in, led his union and all that. So I learned a lot from him just in our conversations and supporting him in some of the work that he was doing. He liked me to review some of the complaints because I was a good speller when I was a little girl. That we've seen a lot of these dynamics play out over time, and most recently because we're seeing a lot of the same exploitive, unboundaried workplace experiences affect all of us. So whether you're working at Amazon, whether you're working at a university, we've seen graduate students strike across the country as well. It catches people at all levels. We're noting that what I will say is that it's because our work dynamics, our dynamics around labor are predicated on this notion earlier of unfree people on stolen land. So we're working with this premise of trying to get a higher return on our investment by not investing as much in the overhead. So in business terms, the overhead is the cost of labor, i.e. paying people, and the cost of keeping whatever building or entity that you have running and going. And so when we identify that there are some people for whom it's okay if they're mistreated, that they are worthy victims. This is language that comes out of some of the research in ethno-violence, that there are worthy victims, people who, for whom it's acceptable to receive and to experience degrading treatment, then it means that all of us have a chance of being perceived in that way. And that at the bedrock of that is this notion of an initial ideal in labor in this country, which is that you try to get as much as you can from people with giving them as little as possible. So our allyship rests on knowing that any one of us can be subjected to the problematic practices in the workplace, and that those problematic practices in the workplace in the US are predicated on the mistreatment of enslaved Africans and First Nations people who were interfaced with colonial forces at this nation's founding. That is why our country has the wealth that it has, because it had low overhead. Does that make sense? Not if you hear me. I'm someone who likes a little call and response, so Zoom doesn't always work that well for me when I'm presenting, but we'll move forward. So I talk a lot about work because that's what my work has been in, and we've already set the groundwork because we know that academia is the launchpad for work, professional career opportunities. One of the things that we have to appreciate is that a key challenge, and this is something I wrote in the book, and that it can be extrapolated to other spaces, is that a key challenge for Black women in the hollowed elite spaces of academia, originally developed for learned men, is that her presence is a subliminal signal that this place is not as valued as the society may have once imagined it to be. So this comes from work from a scholar named Soule in 2013, so years ago, actually 10 years ago, 11 years ago. The value anointed to the halls of academia was deemed so because of the absence of women and folks of color. It was valuable, it was an esteemed place because we weren't there. And so when she is there experiencing the perks of, say, the ability to be an intellectual person, to be creative, to not be inside of some of the, I call it the cooking, coddling, and cleaning work that many Black women were subjected to during enslavement and in the Jim Crow era. When she's there, rather as a scholar or as a professor or as a student on par with everybody else who is experiencing the privileges of that space, initially provided to wealthy white men for whom those institutions were created, then as a society, we begin to wonder about the quality of that place. So I wonder if that makes sense to you, but think about it for a second. Think about the way that this nation sits up and holds women's colleges versus other colleges and universities. Think about the way that our society holds up HBCUs versus other colleges and universities, or tribal colleges and universities. There certainly is a way in which we think about these other institutions. We'll never say necessarily that they're lesser than, but we don't necessarily hold them up on par, say, with the Harvards and the Browns and the Columbias, the Ivy Leagues, right? The Ivies were not initially for women, and they weren't for folks of color. And I would venture to say even for folks of diverse religious backgrounds. I have a small story that I won't go into, but I'll say that my first job in New York, was at an institution, Long Island University, that was founded on the principle of educating the immigrant, because Italians and Jews were not permitted initially to attend the Ivy Leagues because it was blatant racism and exclusion. So this idea continues to persist. Now, what we want to talk through and think about then are what are those experiences that BIPOC folks experience in academia? My main thrust here is that I work through and talk about the experiences of Black women because I understand where we sit in a social cultural hierarchy. But what I also know is that there are many folks who are not so far removed from the possibility of having those experiences. And so there's just an interesting way of thinking about that. And so in academia, I would say that two main things are happening. One are microaggressions, and the other is this idea of the imposter syndrome. So we'll spend some time talking about each of these. So microaggressions. This language we know pretty well. There are three types of microaggressions. They happen very fluently and fluidly within academic settings. And what I want to underscore and unpack here too is that the weeding out function, particularly in higher ed institutions, around who should be here and who should not, the idea of rigor, the idea of capacity, and who receives support and who does not, really creates context where microaggressions run rampant. And in fact, we don't always recognize them, or folks who are exerting them don't recognize them, because they're also the typical ways in which we've engaged academic environments to give it the sheen of elitism and that highbrow. But there are three types of microaggressions: micro assaults, micro invalidations, and micro insults. So we'll take each by hand. And if we can, maybe we can play a little game. If you can find your reaction function on your Zoom, we'll go through each. And as we are going through each of them, I'd like for you to raise your hand or show the raise hand function in Zoom if you've experienced this in an academic space. So remembering higher ed, if you are out of school now, and if you're currently a student, well, yeah, I haven't even said what it is just yet. You're ahead of the game. We'll go through each of them. And so you tell me, have I experienced that microaggression before? And if so, or that type of microaggression, then raise your hand. But clearly I know Yazik is going to raise his hand at some point. So micro assaults, these are deliberate and intentional slights or insults that are meant to hurt the intended victim through name calling, avoidant behavior, and purposeful discriminatory actions. It can be abusive language. It can be assuming one is not the author of their work. We see this as a microaggression in academic spaces. Someone might say, oh, are you sure you wrote this? Did you plagiarize? Can you show me the reference for this or that? And the student is like, this is my original thought. Like, I literally wrote this. And at the same time, look at these hands going up. And at the same time, it also feels, kind of persecutory because, here I am doing my best and trying my best in this environment. And also, I'm not being recognized for having done my best. In fact, someone thinks my best work is somebody else's work, which is hurtful. I would say the misuses of our digital space, virtual space, so posting offensive signs or pictures intentionally online. So we know that social media space becomes a place where we see the inner attitudes of our faculty, of our staff, of our students exhibited in this space. And I would also say misuses of electronic mail or of email, the ways in which we garner and pull in folks' attention around topics that are of interest to us or our particular perspectives. Nobody asked you about that, and you could share it certainly within your group of friends and colleagues separate in a way, because when an email hits the whole group, everyone is subjected to this idea. So there, I belong to a few professional associations. I'm on listservs. There are reasons why we have rules for listservs, is what I will say. So thank you all for raising your hands. One, I just want to say that I'm sorry to see so many people endorsing it. And also, I'm not surprised, right? I'm not surprised. Let's look at the next one. Micro invalidations are when someone attempts to discredit or minimize the experiences of a person who is from an unrepresented group. You could be LGBTQ, you can have a disability, or, have you could be a person who is non-white. You can all the things. Basically, the idea is that, and what I want to speak to is the role of allyship in this space as well. because I know that when I've had that moment of, did that just happen to me? When I've reached out and shared with a friend or a colleague, and I say, wow, like this just happened, and I tell the story, and for that person to say, which has happened, well, maybe they were just having a bad day. Or maybe you heard that wrong. Or maybe, you were in a mood, you've been going through blah, 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 right? Or maybe it was racist, or maybe it was sexist, and that's what I experienced. What happens when someone shares this information, shares this story, and is told maybe you didn't experience what you thought you experienced? That's called gaslighting, right? That's called gaslighting. And it's very, very um, uh, undermining. But what I will also say is that, especially when one is coming through the lens of friendship and a trusted ally or friend or colleague, and they're looking for, like, did you see that? That kind of recognition, sort of mirroring and acknowledgement. It feels particularly hurtful and makes one feel alienated and isolated, perhaps, as well. And that worsens that feeling. So it's not only the thing happened, it's on top of that, the people that you thought had your back or supported you, you don't really feel like you have that. And we know from our stress literature and literature around racial microaggressions and things that happen in these spaces, that feeling that at least one other person sees what happened and that they feel that that is wrong too, that is supportive and feeling a sense of belonging. All right. Thank you for raising your hands. And again, sorry that you had that experience. And again, I'm not surprised. Finally, our micro insults. Now, these are instances, where one is just rude or insensitive, that, a comment that is insensitive, that subtly disrespects a person's racial heritage or identity. This could be assuming that someone isn't smart based on their appearance, or implying that certain groups of people don't have morals. They might even be used to suggest that someone doesn't belong. So we see this in a lot of spaces too, right? And I'll name a few more. Maybe English is not your first language, so you're in the US being educated and you're enjoying your program, but because you speak maybe through a thicker accent or dialect, someone is questioning your intelligence, despite the fact that one is managing multiple languages and perhaps their brain is working on overtime and is a sign of deeper intelligence, perhaps, right? Maybe the way that one dresses, so urban gear, hoodies, jeans, sneakers. These are things that one would say, like, oh, well, younger people or folks in urban environments, i.e. Black people, this is how they dress. So when you wear that, I have an assumption around your intelligence, because these aren't the folks that I typically see in the higher ed institution. Then when these fashion styles are, spread out and become more popularized and are worn by folks across cultures and cultural experiences, now it's okay. And so this young person who, or this individual who is white or appears to be wealthy or have access of some sort, that then distinguishes them from the folks that, typically wear this way, or where the style is coming from, the culture that's coming from, typically hip hop culture. Now it's okay. But until and before then, it was a sign that perhaps this person lacks sophistication or the ability to be in this space. We sometimes say things like they're not a good fit. And that has a lot of undertones in that space, and it's deeply problematic. Now, do I have designs around dressing professional and doing all the things? Yeah, I do. And what I will also say is that style and fashion are a beautiful thing. I lived for many years in New York, and it shows up in a lot of different ways. And you don't have to look like me to work with me. Okay. So these are the three types of microaggressions. I see that, again, some repeat offenders here in terms of the hands being raised around having experienced these things. I wonder if we can just sort of share off mute, if there's anyone who'd like to share an experience or just a reaction to talking these through and endorsing some of these comments, and or witnessing our colleagues and friends endorsing these comments. I guess you'd have to raise your hand for me to see it. And Julie, I don't know if your hand is a legacy hand raise, and Marin. Okay. So would anyone like to share it all? Or do you just want to keep listening? I'm fine either way. But I like to hear from folks. I feel like these are pretty provocative questions and comments. So.
Hi, good evening. I can share.
Okay. Thank you, Arnella. And I think
So
Anita had her hand up for next, if I understood that correctly. Okay. Arnella, you first, and then Anita, and then we'll move on.
oh my gosh, my camera is being odd, sorry.
okay.
Prior to applying to fielding, I was looking at a university here in Canada where I'm based,
Okay.
and I went to one of their information sessions. Had gone to the psych department to see
Mm,
if I could make an appointment, chat with some folks, see if the program was right for me. And
mhm,
one of the persons, I look like I look, and my accent is much less thick than when I had gone there.
mhm,
And I remember the lady at the front, and I'd had an appointment as well. I'd had an
mhm,
appointment to see if I could talk to someone, and the lady was just like, "Sorry, why are you here?" And I was just like, "Oh, I wanted to see if I could meet with a faculty member or an older student just to get an idea of the program." And they're just like, "And you want to attend for the program here?" And I was just like, "I don't understand why you're asking me these questions." And they kept
mm,
asking me quite a few questions. And I remember calling my partner and was just like, "I don't know
mm,
if it was me or like maybe I'm just sensitive today," kind of a thing. I was just like,
mm,
this person just kept badgering me with questions around, "Are you sure this is the right place?" And
mhm,
I was just like, "I've been contacting you guys via email, so I don't understand what all these questions are
mhm,
in this moment." And it had turned out that was kind of my big thing for why I was just like, it would be more convenient to attend a school that's literally 10 minutes away from where I live. But also, if this is how your admin staff is going to be treating me, that doesn't
mhm,
give me a lot of confidence in terms of how your overall program would kind of be looking at me and be dealing with me. And at that time, I did know that they had no folks of color in their program. And so I was just like, yeah, thanks. I don't want to be your guinea pig kind of a thing.
mm. Arnella, thank you so much. I'm glad that we were here, that you could choose us, by the way. But yeah, that's really disheartening when you're at the start of trying to discover where you might go, what you might do, and to be on the receiving end of a bunch of questions that aren't really going anywhere. Anita.
Well, a couple of things crossed my mind as you were speaking.
Mhm,
When you brought up the topic of microaggressions, I'm remembering how, and many times in lectures or in business meetings,
mhm,
I would somehow, while my English is excellent, I speak with no accent whatsoever, that oftentimes phrases would be repeated to me, seemingly for my benefit. We're going to
mm,
speak about microaggressions, like small slights, Anita.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Go
yeah,
on. Why are you translating this for me?
right.
uh, and I would see that both in small group settings
Yeah.
and often in larger
Mhm,
auditorium settings or big plenary sessions, where there might be several people
mhm,
from Latino communities sitting together, and then we would get a little translation, into it. And it was never English Spanish translation; it was always academic speak
yes.
into more common language.
Right.
So that was
Oh,
one that I thought of as you were
how
speaking.
offensive.
Mhm.
Offensive. Okay. Thank you, both Anita and Arnella, for sharing your experiences. Again, I hate that you've had those experiences, but there's a reason why there's a pretty developed literature in this area, and that's because it is an experience that many people do have. So, imposter syndrome. What I would say is that all the microaggressions ultimately create the context, create the environmental cues of non-belonging, right? And non-belonging seeds this notion of maybe being an imposter, that I don't belong here, that I'm not supposed to be here, and therefore I need to figure my way out and around here. Imposter syndrome is the condition of feeling anxious and not experiencing success internally, despite being high performing in external objective ways. So here's the point, that a person who is experiencing imposter syndrome is actually highly qualified, likely overqualified. I've done some work and some consultation with some pretty accomplished scientists um, in an organization based out of New York. And these women asked me to come and talk through imposter syndrome and intersectionality. And I thought, oh my gosh, like this is the place. I'm talking actual rocket scientists and folks who were, this was in 2017, 18. They were already talking through implications of artificial intelligence on our academic space. So now we're dealing with something that this scholar 5 years ago, 6 years ago, was beginning to write about. All to say she was a genius, right? But she was feeling, despite being high performing based on every measure external to herself, her research, her practice, her everything, her awards, that she wasn't good enough. She didn't belong in that space. How odd, right? This condition often results in people feeling like a fraud or a phony, and that's what happens. You feel like an imposter. Am I supposed to be here? It really sets up this really interesting dynamic, because I note that more recently, a lot of women, a lot of folks of color, and folks who are typically undermined and under, for whom there is low expectations, are sometimes doing the overcorrect. And so then it looks as if, or feels as if, they're maybe being a bit braggadocious and narcissistic, but really it's not that. The reality is that there is this need to show up and to amplify one's abilities, which looks like, wow, this person really thinks a lot of themselves, but really they have to think that much of themselves to feel the balance in some of these spaces, which gives them the environmental cues that they don't belong. Have you all ever seen or noticed that? A little bit, yeah. What I'll say here is that microaggressions in academia, and I've said it before, they run rampant because there's actually some practices and behaviors within academic culture that are microaggressions. The ways in which we treat in groups and out groups, the ways in which we highlight some over others, or create space for some to feel like this is your academic home, you belong here, you are fine. And then others are not feeling as if they're being recognized for their abilities, so then they begin to doubt their abilities. So what do we do about this? In my book, I talk about refusal and recover strategies, and particularly those coming out of Afro and Indigenous refusal strategies. So, I won't go as much into that background here, but there is a long legacy of African descent folks refusing, being in a refusal posture against the horrible ideas that in this country have been systematically leveraged to justify the mistreatment, the abuse, and the I would say compelled labor from folks. And that Indigenous folks have also been quite active in engaging in practices that can move them more toward the sovereignty that they, I don't want to say even deserve, but are entitled to, despite a colonial practice within this country. And so these refusal strategies come up in four ways, and they're interrelated, i.e. the box is connecting, it's just all interrelated. So 4 ideas. Refusal is generative. Refusal is social and affiliative. Refusal is not mere resistance, and refusal is hopeful and it is willful. So let's dig in a little bit and think about how these might shape the life experience of a person in academia. Okay. So refusal is generative. What do we mean by this? Ultimately, and the way I like to talk about it, is that a good no makes room for a quality yes. So a lot of times we fill a lot of our time and energy and space with people, experiences, and encounters that are demoralizing, that are invalidating. And we have to make decisions about whether or not this is the place for my gifts, right? So our colleague Arnella raised up, having made a different decision. That's actually a refusal practice, Arnella, to hear what someone is saying, believe them when they tell you who they are, and make a decision accordingly. That's what you did, right? So what I will say is this, that if we busy ourselves trying to prove and trying to be in a reactive experience with an environment or with a set of people or whatnot that are devaluing us or treating us in a way that is not welcoming, we're actually taking really good energy and power and focus that we could put toward our goals, and we're directing it toward an individual or entity that may likely not have a changed mind about that. So we have to make decisions around that. What I would say is that if we say no, when we say no, it makes room for a yes that makes us available for new ideas, new ways of being in relationship with people, and other opportunities. You may decide, like Arnella did, to leave, or not go into a particular direction, or had Arnella stayed and gone to that institution, perhaps the decision point would have been like, do I stay here? Maybe I need to leave and transfer out. A lot of students actually find fielding in that way. You'd be surprised the number of stories of folks who've had pretty oppressive and problematic experiences with folks and with entities and other in those spaces, and decided to come to fielding. And so fielding became a part of their refusal practice. And I'm not trying to suggest that fielding is, you know, a haven for all wonderful things. I recognize that we're an academic environment and that we are going to perpetuate some of the same things because we're not immune from that, right? We're inside of this larger social cultural construct, and we're having the students of ours and our staff and our faculty are also having some of this experiences that I'm talking about here. What I will say too is that sometimes that no is internal. So when you're refusing, you're saying no. Sometimes it's not a big protest vote or, you know, expression. Sometimes we just make a decision around how we're going to give our time and our energy. Most recently, I would say in the last 2 years, and particularly as folks were experiencing a lot of challenges to their work and professional experiences during COVID, is this idea of quiet quitting came up. You know, hear about that? Or yeah, quiet quitting. What is it basically? It essentially is sort of, well, you know, do your job, but pull back your energy and your investment so that you're not so overly invested in a system or structure that is not as invested in you and is causing you stress to be invested in something that is not as invested in you. I think more than anything, what it does is starts an important conversation with you internally, right? So this is an internal conversation in some ways with how I'm or you will manage your time and your energy, how you might reassert boundaries and or assert new boundaries that allow for you to have a nice gap or buffer break between the stress point of an environment that may have some levels of toxicity and your own health and mental health and wellness. Okay. Refusal is also social and affiliative. What do we mean by this? What I know for certain is that speaking your truth out loud about what you want and what you do not want helps you to find your people and for your people to find you, right? So I come up, I already told you about my father who was in union. So that's a part of it, right? A group of workers coming together and saying, hey, we like or we don't like this particular thing. I also spent a lot of my youth in protest. And so again, when you go to a protest, you find your people. These are other people who believe very strongly in the cause that you believe in. I could tell you stories about that, but we'll stay focused so that we can finish on time and there's time for questions and discussion later. And so what I will say though is that as our within an academic environment, one of the things I've loved seeing at Fielding are the ways that our students gather together and articulate what their needs are in group spaces, whether it's some of our affinity spaces. So our BSA, who's hosting this event tonight, we have a group of students who are identifying as international students, students who are identifying as LGBTQI and Two-Spirit, students who are identifying as caregivers, students who are identifying as veterans. So finding your people, people who have a similar or shared experience as you, really is refusing something that happens when we're experiencing the microaggressions and the imposter syndrome in higher ed. And what it's doing is making you, allowing one not to be on their own with that. It's creating a sense of collegiality. And what's been happening for us, and I know my colleagues, Dr. Davis White-Eyes and Dr. Lindsay could speak to this, is that when students join and gather together to share what their shared experiences are and what their needs are, we're then able to then as an institution respond to that because we understand like, oh, this is an experience of our constituency and we want to make sure that our students feel heard and are supported. It creates the connection and community that really then can undermine senses of non-belonging, which I think again just really undermine and chip away at, you know, eat away at a sense of feeling connected, but also being able to do your best work. The reality is if you're stressed around some of the dynamics that we've talked about before, that means you're distracted from why you're here. Our students, I believe strongly, are not here to experience being demoralized by other students, by faculty, by staff, by anything. And so what I want for us is to always have those spaces where we can come together, name our needs, and move forward in a direction that is positive and productive so that you can come here for what you came here for, which was to get your degree and to learn and to grow, and to also leave with community and a network of folks who feel supportive of you. Ultimately, when you speak what is important to you, you create the opportunity to do something to improve those conditions. And that's important. So refusal is not mere resistance. So resistance, we always think about, we have to resist and we have to, you know, resist this and resist that, and resistance as a posture and an approach. Pretty much thinking in the perspective of protest. And resistance has its role, but what I will say is that that is not what refusal is. Resistance, in many ways, if you're resisting something, you are responding to that something. It's this external out there thing that is requiring and pulling your time, energy, and attention. Yes, we do need to attend to those things and resist where necessary, but that's not a place from which to own and grow your own sense of purpose and direction. That's a reaction to something. When you have an internally defined perspective and center of gravity by which you move, then your needs are articulated and your desires are articulated from an honest place from within you. Resistance, yes, has its place, but it also, when we are resisting, we are sharing and giving power to that with which we're resisting. It's someone else's agenda. What refusal does do is it does not recognize an outside entity as actually having the power to ever diminish you in the first place. It doesn't give it that power. You have to give someone that power. And so, what I love about these strategies, particularly from an Afro and Indigenous perspective, because I know that my history, historically, and my ancestors, both African descent and Indigenous, had to have their own internally defined notions of success, of moving forward, of happiness, because what was crafted in this world and in this country in particular was not guided by them internally. In fact, them as individuals, as human beings, recognized, loved, and supported wasn't wasn't in the idea in the founding of this country. And so refusal has meant to sort of name your own process and your own experience. So back to what Anita was saying about, this idea of watering down content that wasn't about language, but was really speaking into this notion of intelligence and how, that's a collusion that, those need to be uncoupled in that space. That the group of folks, that Anita was sitting with perhaps had to determine for themselves whether or not that actually applied to us. So even if someone's behaving that way, that doesn't mean anything about you or the group. It actually means something about that individual, or it means something about that system or that structure that is orienting itself to those with maybe a thick accent or a strong dialect. Does that make sense? Okay. I always come back to this because I think it's so important. What I believe we need to do, and what I want for our students, what I want for everyone, is to preserve your energy and your focus on your own growth, your healing, and your development. And those are the communities that you care for, and those communities that contribute to your health, growth, and development. Everything else can become a bit of a waste of your time, and you can spin out doing that rather than what you came here to do. You have a goal and a purpose and a calling, and I really hope for each of you to engage that more deeply. Toni Morrison has this famous quote that I love so much where she says that racism is essentially a distraction. And that really sits so squarely with me because that's, we can get really occupied in someone else's focus and structure. Now, finally, refusal is hopeful and willful. And I hope that you feel that, even though we've talked about some difficult things today, but I'm okay with talking about difficult things because you get over it, through it, move it, and go forward. Refusal is hopeful and willful. And what I mean by that is that it creates opportunity and space to dream. I believe strongly that each of our students, when they enter our educational space, are responding to an urge that was a dream, that there was an idea that I should do this, or I could go off to school and do this. And particularly for our students, now I know that all of our students don't necessarily find themselves in the upper reaches of the age spectrum, but Fielding was founded and grounded on this idea of really creating a quality learning experience for an adult learner who did not have the privilege of leaving home and relocating and going to a whole other place to have this big experience in academia. Brick and mortar institutions require that. But our lives really don't always afford that. In 1974, there was this bright idea that the rest of the world now has caught up with 50 years later. But here we are. Refusal creates the space for our students to respond to that dream. And I believe very much that we need to honor that dream and be respectful of the energy, time, and effort, and the yes that our students have given themselves to be here now. The yes is the room for something else and more in the future, something that you actually will want. And so when we are in a posture of refusal, we're making space for that next thing that we actually desire and want, rather than responding to things that we don't want. Ultimately, refusal puts us in a posture to recover ourselves and to reclaim our power. And that's what I think is so very vital and important for each of us. So that concludes my formal talk. I would love for us to engage in some conversation and just sort of hear where we'll land. I'm going to stop sharing. I see these chats in the box, so I don't know if those are chats for me. This will be an opportunity for me to take a look at those as well. But I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. This has been such a gift, just to be able to share some of the work that I'm always sharing so broadly with others, again, back here in this home space with us at Fielding. So let's see there. Okay.
So we're going to open the floor. Just raise your hand if you have any questions, Provost.
Yeah.
I know she conducts town halls, but this is another opportunity to engage with her.
Yes, Yazik.
Greetings. Thank you for your presentation. Lots of important information and perspectives and points. And I kind of wanted to highlight what you were speaking on in terms of refusal, because ironically, I was just having a conversation with like 3 of my sons on the phone yesterday. They range from ages 18 to 26.
Okay.
And I was talking about the concept of resisting, and then how, in my opinion, is sometimes that's not enough, because you could resist. Someone could be offering you a hamburger and you're not really hungry. You'd be like, no, 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 no. And then eventually they're like, come on, man, have it. Come on. You go, okay, I take it. But like, and I was saying that I prefer to use the word rebuke. Like some things need to be rebuked and not just resisted. Because sometimes you could put up a little bit of resistance, but you don't really mean it. But I think it's, so I appreciate the semantics of the situation when you articulate the construct of refusal and from a position of power. And I think that that's significant. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that I hear you loud and clear on that. And I think there, it's nothing wrong with us expanding our dynamics of how we look at things that we're gonna not tolerate.
Understood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice conversation to have with your sons, who are all men.
Oh, word. Yeah, it's pretty crazy to have a 26-year-old like that, but yeah, I do.
For sure. Arnella?
I'm not entirely certain of the situation in the States, but just this week, several universities here in Canada has essentially banned affirmative action steps in terms of DEI programs, and staff have been let go. And I'm just curious around, how do we manage this idea of resisting, which I think is an absolute necessity if we are going to kind of move against these powers of oppression, and do so in ways that are helpful and helpful for us, as well as we do live in these systems and structures. And so how do we balance these situations, especially when you consider that many of these DEI programs are as a result of, well, the current systems of oppression that still exist and are perpetuated in most spaces. I'm just curious as to your, I suppose, response and opinion around that.
I love this question. You can barely open a news paper, or I guess it's really a news app now, if I'm honest. I don't have newspapers, but you can barely open one without seeing a new way in which, within this country or in other countries as well, this country, US, and but Canada as well, and other places as well, where there is a sort of unraveling of the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and justice initiatives that have happened. And what I would do is I would hearken back to the wisdom of our dear ancestor, Toni Morrison. I think that it's actually meant to be a distraction. This is the way that you keep, when people talk about 2 steps forward or 1 step forward, 2 steps back, this is that moment in our history of the 2 steps back, where we fight this thing. And then when we are able to move the needle a little bit, it's moving it back to where it was, as opposed to the forward that we actually want to go. Does that make sense? And so I think this is where I talk about a lot, Arnella, around preserving your energy. Yes, of course, we do need to do the things tactically to respond to that. I'm very strategic in that way. So what are the ways in which we, respond to that in a policy way, in a way that, yes, we can do truth to power and protest, but as folks have often talked about, and then who's going to go into the halls of justice and the halls of our legislators and the halls of governance and make sure to set up the infrastructure for equity moving forward. It's not enough to yell in the streets. That is useful. And then what? Right? So that's what I would say. I would say, let's be tactical, let's be strategic, but let's stay focused. Stay focused, because it is meant to, I believe, to distract you so that when there is a win, which is really a win toward not allowing everything to roll back and to maybe keep some of the gains, it really just keeps you in the same space. And so you never move forward, which is really the point, I believe. Does that help? Okay. Lynette, hello.
Hi, Wendi. Hi. Good evening, everyone, and congratulations. And thank you for all of your hard work in terms of your studies with fielding. I am not part of this institution right now. I do live in Santa Barbara, though, and I am familiar with fielding. But you're so lucky to have Wendi. She was with us at Mills College for several years, and I enjoyed every moment, as all of us did, working with her. She enhanced our experiences and our workshops and our retreats and everything. And we missed her. We miss her. We still miss you. And I want you to know, if you don't, and you all should know this, that the merger was difficult. It was difficult for students and alums and even curriculum. Certain majors are in jeopardy right now because of the accreditation process. So for example, we don't have an ethnic studies major right now, which is a real big deal that we're fighting for. But I just want to say that Wendi left the School of Education and the master's program in such stellar shape that Wendi, it's the first program to be moving forward. Next fall, they will begin to grant the master's degree from the School of Education in concert with Mills at Northeastern University. So when you mention, women's colleges and our challenges and our lack of regard and the lack of education for women, what you said today was so important, even to me, and I haven't really been in academia I won't tell you what year I graduated, but it was a while ago. Some of you weren't born. But I'm just happy to connect with you as soon as I got this. I just had to show up and support you and send you love. So thank you.
Oh, I receive it. Thank you so much. And it's so good to see you.
You too.
Okay. AG.
Hi, Wendi.
Hi.
Thank you for that insightful presentation. I'm wondering about the intersection of the angry Black woman motif and refusal, and whether you think that active refusal is ever inhibited by the reluctance to appear.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Look at you.
Right?
That's a good question. That's a really great question. I think so. So I went to undergrad at University of California, Davis. I promise I'm going to answer your question, AG. But I went to UC Davis, and I was so lucky to be able to sit in a room where one of my sheroes was speaking to us, Dr. Alice Walker. It was or not Dr. Alice Walker. Not doctor. I hold her in such esteem. I'm sure she has an honorary doctorate from multiple places, but in any case, it was when her book Possessing the Secrets of Joy came out, which was about female mutilation. But what I will say is that in that conversation, she was talking to us as a group of folks, and I remember I maybe 18 or 19 years old. I was really young. She talked about controlling the role of stereotypes to control. And Patricia Hill Collins talks a lot about this in her book, Black Feminist Thought. The idea of stereotypes as being controlling. And they're controlling because, one, they place folks in a box, so strong Black woman or angry Black woman box. And then they're also controlling because this individual may try to disrupt and interrupt the idea that she's angry or whatever the case is, strong or whatever the case may be. And there are stereotypes for all of us. So, but for this idea of the strong Black woman or the angry Black woman is interesting, I think, AG, to your point, because it can be read as a lot of things, right? So I don't want to be particularly political, but we just saw a really great example of this in the testimony of Fani Willis in Georgia. And I know that's in your neck of the world, woods over in Southeast. And so where she was really in an act of refusal in those responses, but people were projecting onto her that she was angry. I think she was probably a little like, okay, enough already. Like, you all are focusing on me, distraction from this other case that we have in front of us. I think that she could have demurred and tried not to appear the way that she felt. But here we get into these spaces of inauthenticity. And this also becomes a distraction. So in some of my work around leadership, I talk with folks about the need to live authentically into who you are as a human being, as your personality, how you actually feel and where you actually stand, because it makes you more strong. The minute that you begin to comport yourself and adjust yourself to respond to an external gaze, a patriarchal gaze, a white gaze, an ableist gaze, you diminish yourself because you're now not able to act out of your authenticity. Our strength in leadership is to be our whole selves. And so what I will say to that is, yes, I know, and one of the reasons why I wrote this book in the way that I did, I wrote it, is that I want to support Black women in particular, but anyone who can draw strength and wisdom from this work to lead in an authentic way, because that is where your power is to lead well. When your brain is preoccupied with how you look or how you're going to look to someone or what they're going to think about you, guess what you're not doing? Focusing on solving the issue of the budget, focusing on solving the issue of this, focusing on addressing whatever the case may be, what what your actual work is, because it's the distraction of your personal self, if that makes sense. So I would say, yeah, like I think it's definitely something to grapple with. It's one of the reasons why I do mentor a lot of folks. I do have a lot of mentees, all over the place, mostly just to give people permission to be themselves, to be quite honest, because otherwise they spend a lot of time doing things that are not from that sort of internal direction of where they want to do their good work and where they can do their best work, but are rather responding to the gaze of an other outside of themselves. And I would say an other outside of themselves who does not love them and does not love what they love, and therefore cannot advise them accordingly anyway. So.
Woo!
Nathan?
Yeah, so I have the same reaction as AG. I mean, I'm trying to like organize up a little bit. Like I have so many things I want to comment on, but what's fresh is literally what you were just mentioning about showing up as yourself. Because that of many of the topics that you discussed really hit home, because outside of our conversations, outside of this forum, but just talking to other professionals and like practicum, and just as I've kind of been developing, trying to like find myself as like being in the tail end of this doctoral journey, and just looking at my life as well as a Black man and all these different spaces. And I've accomplished a lot of things for my just, I mean, I've been in school literally all my life, back to back. So, but I have made a lot of, you mentioning showing up as your authentic self and kind of giving that permission is really significant for me, because I've been kind of navigating that, especially as I think about the next steps in my professional journey. And one of the things that I wanted to also comment on was your discussion on imposter syndrome, because that's been something that's been heavy on my mind. I've been like kind of reflecting. It's like, I matched for internship, and I'm like thinking, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of like getting close to that next step, and like defending my dissertation and things like that. So, I've been reflecting on like I know I made all these professional academic accomplishments, but like, what can I do to show that, I really deserve to like be in this position, like, have this degree. So I kind of been grappling with that a little bit. So your conversation was, and I'll kind of just end it there with the comments, but you talked about so many relevant things. And I appreciate it, especially as one of, I'll say like a handful of Black male students in the program. This is something that I think is really relevant and a really helpful conversation to have. I do have a question, just in the sense of like, if you have any recommendations of like additional readings or resources on this topic, but specifically for like Black men around these various topics that you discussed.
Mm.
Sorry, I
Well,
know that was loaded.
No, I don't apologize. I am
I'm
so
working on
proud of, okay. I'm so proud of you. Matching is such a huge deal. It's so competitive. We're so proud of you. And, you know, we want you to leave with a very powerful wind at your back with our care and love for you as you go out into the world to become the professional that you will be. I love this book by Bell Hooks, which is little known by a lot of folks, but it's called The Will to Change. It came out in 2004, I believe. And it's about Black men and masculinity. Because what I would say that is, you know, we are all boxed in, actually. It's really quite profound how these categories and boxes and ways in which we're perceived then control us. So the vulnerability that you just shared is so something that people don't always feel permission to do. So I really thank you for sharing and being trusting me and trusting us in this space. And also to, I think you might like that book. You know, Bell Hooks is also an ancestor now. She died during in the midst of the pandemic, the early days. But she's left us with such a legacy of good thinking about love, about community and communion, and also, you know, just these ideas around how to liberate yourself from being controlled by other people's thoughts about you. So here's a thing that I say and that my grandmother used to say, which is that what other people think about you is none of your business. It's their business. What you think about yourself is your business. So let's think good things. I believe in you. We believe in you. But you got to believe in you. And I think that is where you sit squarely in front of whatever situation is in front of you. And if there's any opportunity or experience you lose because you are being too much of you, that is a blessing to be released from a situation that was going to harm you. Walk away.
Wow. I guess
Yeah. Yeah.
that was this whole presentation. So thank you.
You're so welcome.
I had a question, if I may. I didn't raise my hand though.
You raised your voice.
We
Oh,
had the E Society had raised their hand right when you started to speak.
Oh,
Zeke.
okay.
okay, I didn't see that, but go ahead. It's all good.
Okay, thank you, Zeke.
Hi.
Oh, there you
Also,
are.
hi, I'm also known as Dr. Neen, the
Hi,
strategy queen. Yes, I'm a Fielding alum, so I'm
Okay.
really excited to be here. I couldn't find the little raise your
Okay.
hand, so I said I just will do it regular.
Okay. Okay.
Sometimes
Okay.
that actually works.
No problem.
Um,
We saw you.
Thank you. So earlier you had asked if we had any situations that we would say
Mm-hmm.
were reflective of what you're talking about. And I've been to a few events. I haven't been getting out much since COVID. So I'm like, I'm going to get out there and network
Okay.
again. And so these thoughts started coming up because that's what people were talking about on the panels.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to really, really, really think hard. And I was like, oh, I have one. I have a story. So I remember when I was in graduate school, I have multiple degrees. So this particular graduate degree was an MBA.
Okay.
And I remember that the person who was supposed to be in charge of, they were acting like he was the mentor, but he really was grading us. So I was like, how can you do both? And so anytime I would question something, he would just get really upset. And he would say, you all don't know how to do this. You don't know how to do that. There were only, it was a executive MBA program, and there were 5 women in a class of 25 people.
Okay.
So, and then there were only 2 women of color One other woman of color dropped out. She was Asian. And so they're left the two Black girls.
Okay.
And um, I will call her my friend. She was really into speaking about um, her position as a Black female. And I
Mhm.
was just always talking about being a female. Anyway, they had a
Mm.
program where you could go overseas
Mhm.
um, and take classes through this school. And so
Okay.
I did that. When I
Mhm.
came back, I found out another gentleman had decided to be in the gay men's choir, and he
Okay.
missed about the same amount of time that I did. So
Okay.
they called me apart from other people and said, "We're docking you points." I said, "Why?" "Because you missed class." I didn't miss class. I was overseas, and it was a sanctioned program of the university, and you signed off on it, etc. And I said, "Well, what about him?" They're like,
Mm.
"Well, we want to support gay men, so we're not going to dock him any points." And I
Oh.
was like, "Okay, how come I'm getting a B in this program when everybody on my team is getting
Yeah.
an A and I helped write these papers that we turn in?" So every
Mhm.
time I turned around, he'd be trying to dock me points, dock me points. And I said, "You know, it sounds to me that," because I already had a doctorate, he
Mhm.
said, I said, "It sounds to me that you are envious of the fact that no matter what you do, I'm still going to succeed." And people would
Mm.
pull me aside. They say, "Did you notice that every time you bring up a point, he will act like he didn't hear what you said, and you will
Oh.
go further
Mhm.
on the question?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've noticed that with the other professors too." But
Yeah.
the other people who were my allies would always be saying, "Well, as Nina said," because that's
Yeah.
my name, they say,
Yeah.
"As she just said," because I'm
Yeah.
anticipating what's happening in the course, because
Mhm.
I already know pretty much what's going to be presented
Mhm.
that day.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so people started telling me, "We're noticing some strange things, that they really don't like women in this program." And I
Boy.
was like, "That's really,
Mm.
offensive to hear,
Mhm.
because you don't really want to believe that someone is
Mm.
actively trying to undermine you." So, I
Mhm.
just kept moving on, moving on. I called uh, a meeting with some higher ups, and
Mm.
I wanted to know how to donate some money to the university. They thought I was having this meeting to talk about them. Like,
Mm.
why do I care about you? I'm moving forward, and what you think about me is none of my business unless it's affecting my goals. So they tried to preempt my meeting with the higher up, and tried to tell they I came into the room, and I'm like, "I feel like people have been talking about me." And when
Mm.
I rearranged the room and did all this stuff, because it was my meeting, that he was just huffing and puffing. So every time I would stand in my power, I could see that he would just, "Arr,"
Mhm.
I'm like, "I'm going to graduate no matter what you do."
Mhm.
And of course I did. I graduated
Mhm.
and had my
Mhm.
MBA. So I want to say that it's interesting to see how many of those kind of stories I just push to the side, they don't even care about. But when
Yeah.
other people are sharing them, I'm thinking that might be helpful and encouraging to someone else to hear. So maybe I should dredge those up. I want to thank you
Oh.
for your presentation. I
Oh,
think it's
thank you.
amazing. I'm going to send you a private message, because
Okay.
one of the ladies in my group has something called conscious conversations. Someone else was
Mm.
asking, how do we talk about these things? And she's
Mm.
created an infographic with the
Oh,
steps. So I
nice.
wanted to get your feedback on that.
I would love
Um,
to.
Thank you.
You have to, it's always interesting. And I would say that a space in which you sitting in your power is a trigger for someone else, because it sounds like you were triggering him, is actually quite dangerous for you. And yeah, that feels unsafe actually, for you to be an authorized human and to sort of just have a self-esteem and hold yourself with regard, for that to trigger someone where they become huffy and puffy. I'm concerned about that.
Well, it's funny that you would mention that. I was the only Black in my elementary, my junior high, my high school.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of used to
Absolutely.
creating my own reality.
Yeah.
I created something called wimpy thinking, white imperialistic male privilege thinking. So I have like an entire like little booklet explaining to people
Oh,
how to
wow.
get along in these type of situations. I'm like, "Oh, you just have to adopt the wimpy thinking. If you understand how it works, you can switch it around so you can empower yourself and move forward on it."
You should look up the work of Dr. Janet Helms. It's so interesting that you all came up with the same acronym. You spell it differently, but it sort of ends out in the same place. You put it, yeah, look her up. All right. I think we have time for one more question, Yazik. You started us off and you're gonna end us off.
Okay, cool. I'll
Okay,
okay. Make it quick. It was
All right.
the quote that you mentioned earlier when you said racism was a distraction. Did you
Yeah.
say that was from Toni Morrison?
That is Toni Morrison. It goes a little something like this. I'm going to get it wrong because it's a bit of a paragraph, but she basically says, it's a distraction when we start getting focused on the size of, the phrenology science, right? The size of a head or an intelligence test that's not normed on a broad range of people and all these other measurements, which kind of sort of have revealed themselves to be a type of pseudoscience to legitimize racist thinking and hierarchical, put folks, human beings in a hierarchy of value. And to be quite honest, the field of psychology, my field, has this very terrible history of having done that. And most recently, the American Psychological Association issued an apology to BIPOC folks, specifically about the ways that the science of psychology was utilized to justify and legitimize racist thinking. But she basically says that that is a distraction. Now you're focusing and thinking about the size of your head instead of, the art you would create or the book you would write or the love that you would cultivate with friends, family, and community and colleagues. And so to be distracted from that is the real loss. And so again, to remain focused on what your purpose and intention is so that you can continue to do what you were called here to do. We only have a little bit of time on this planet. So do we really want to chase that, or do we want to do this other thing that is more aligned with our goals and our gifts?
Right, indeed. I resonate with that 100%. You mentioned that phrenology because a lot of racist ideas were also supported by Darwin. Darwin wasn't a
Correct.
friend of Black people, so they tend to reduce humanity just a bunch of biological cells bumping around the planet and just all about survival of the fittest and struggling in war instead of us learning principles that are higher nature. So I agree with that, and then maybe we could kind of follow up on some of these topics at another time because I know time is
I
limited.
would love it. Just be
Cool.
in touch. We can totally do that.
Cool. Appreciate you.
This has been such a joy. I know I'm going to hand it back over to my student colleagues to close us out, but I have to say again, I love this kind of work and these kinds of conversations. So whenever there's time to do it, I'm completely here for it. So thank you all again for your time and your attention and just engaging with me on my scholarship. This is really wonderful tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Provost Williams, for your powerful words. I'm sure that your words were felt and resonated strongly with all of us, especially BIPOC individuals. You took us on a journey of understanding academia's role in maintaining the systems that are in place and how we can combat these practices through refusal and even transfer them into our outside lives. So what I truly appreciate, I think I could have probably sat another hour and listened to you talk. But I know that we are on time constraints and we appreciate you taking that time out to speak with us and engage with us.
It's my absolute pleasure.
I'm not sure if Nate or Shania had anything to say to close us out.
Yes, I just want to again thank you, Provost Williams, for taking your time to share your expertise and bless all of us with your words of wisdom and just again you left me with so many things to reflect on, and I'm sure others as well. And as Sheila mentioned, I could have listened to you for another hour or so.
You all say that now, but if I was your professor, you'd feel very differently.
I would take your class. That's fine. I would take the class. I would take it.
As long as there's
You're so
no
welcome.
assignments, we would be all right.
Okay.
Processing only. Okay. I have
Processing
other
only.
assignments
Okay.
to do.
Understood the very narrow. It's such a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for the idea and for planning all of this. Just joyful to be with you.
And thank you everyone for signing up and attending our diversity speaker series. And BSA will have more events coming over the next couple months as well. So continue to be on the lookout and reach out to BSA with any questions and ways to be involved with BSA.
All right. You all have a good night. Be well. Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Good night.